Today we're going to be speaking with Reece Peck, who's an associate professor at the City University of New York and also author of the book Fox Populism: Branding Conservatism as Working Class. Really appreciate your time and for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So to start with, my understanding of the history of political media, including sort of as described by the book Waves of Rancor, which starts with the use of low power FM and talk radio and sort of all the way through where we are now, is that the political right and the political left have used media differently. Part of that has to do with ownership structure and issues related to money and financing, but part of it also has to do with the right, quite frankly, having better, I would argue, more effective sort of bumper sticker phrases that better lend themselves to some forms of media. Can you talk a little bit about the current landscape and how you would sort of distinguish the way the political right and left use media?
Yeah, well, first off, the right, it's hard to talk about the kind of right versus left media. You really have to think about a kind of liberal corporatist center that dominates the mainstream legacy media, and then this massive right-wing sector that's always been there for multiple generations, and then this little sliver of truly leftist media and these alternative spaces. So you kind of have to break it down in a tripartite model. It's harder to talk about like left media versus liberal centrist media. But the left media, in terms of the history of alternative left media, I mean, today there's a common sense notion that the mainstream media is liberal, has a liberal bias. But if you took a time machine to the 1930s, when they talked about the bias of the press, it was always the capitalist press or the conservative press. And so labor unions and leftists had to create these alternative revenue models, had to kind of fight their way to get on radio. And it's always been this uphill battle. I mean, if you're critical of capitalism and the media system you exist in is commercial in nature, right? It's an uphill battle for funding, for legitimacy. And so that's largely the history of the left, like the true left kind of alternative media. The conservative media, inversely, I guess you'd say, when you have this pro-business class, free market ideology, the wind's at your back, right? You're basically telling media executives and billionaire donors that they're the moral history. I mean, they're the moral heroes. They're the job creators. So they're going to look kindly on you and your content. But I don't think that structural analysis, it can only go so far. And I think leftists throw their hands in the air and they say, well, we don't have the same billionaire backing. We don't have the same funding. And I think you're very right to say there are things in which left media creators do to tie their own hands, to shoot themselves in the foot in terms of messaging, in terms of style, in terms of narrative, that has really catapulted the right. I completely agree with you. They're kind of more sophisticated in terms of their communication and media strategies.
Can you talk a little bit, give some examples of that? And, when I talk to others in the left media space, and when I talk about that, just to be really clear, I'm not talking about MSNBC. MSNBC is sort of like a Democratic Party center-left positioning, corporate profit motives that are identical to Fox News, et cetera, even if some of their policies are different. Certainly their editorial perspective is different. But when I talk to other people in like left independent media, there are many who say, I would gladly accept the millionaire or even billionaire donors of the Daily Wire if they came to me and said, hey, I want to give you money to do exactly what you're doing. The counterpoint to that is those who say, no. By the very nature of having those millionaires or billionaires supporting you, you would not be able to do what you're doing. That's the difference between what the left wants to espouse and what the right wants to espouse. So how much of it is that the messaging of the left is not appealing to those moneyed interests versus something else?
Well, I would say that there was no shortage of millionaire, billionaire money for right-wing media in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, but they were not nearly as successful. And so if it was all money and donations, then how come William F. Buckley wasn't, a kind of populist tabloid hit? Or how come the first generation of conservatives were so ineffective? Their media before Limbaugh, before Fox News, was largely on the margins. It was a boutique kind of segment of the conservative movement. It was only when you get to Limbaugh where you see this blend of kind of profitability. They're a profitable commercial entertainment product, and then conservative ideology. And it's when the conservatives, really with Murdoch's influence, embraces tabloid style and populist style and integrated insights from tabloid public affairs genres like talk radio or tabloid television, that the right attained this kind of level of cultural dominance and prevalence that it did. And so I think there's lessons to be learned from the left, right? The left has this inflexible commitment to this kind of upper middle class, educated, imagined audience in mind when they're designing their style or they're designing their kind of consumer appeals, and they're averse to this tabloid aesthetic. They're averse to kind of populist modes of engagement, and I think that's the success of the right is largely a story of them shifting toward a different style that's more conducive to mass taste and kind of working class identity.
So going back, like, what are the stylistic mistakes that you think the left is making that limit the appeal?
Well, I think the left, especially when, there was this coming to Jesus moment when George W. Bush won his second term. And that was when you see this explosion of kind of anti-Fox media ventures. We got to do something about Fox. You get, Air America is launched. You get Jon Stewart kind of coming into his own and critiquing. And then you get Oberman a little later. And so there's this moment where they're like, we need an unapologetic kind of form of progressive media to counter what Fox is doing. I think my critique there is they went all in on sarcasm and comedy and this kind of ironic style. That was the way they were going to be popularly appealing. And that has its uses. And we all like, to a degree, the satirical style. But I think it's limited when you have other ways you can speak to people with sincerity, with emotional expressiveness, with recruiting certain personalities that don't come from prestige sectors of the journalism field. And that's exactly what Fox did. MSNBC had a slight moment of flirtation with populist-styled hosts with Cenk Uygur and Dylan Ratigan and Ed Schultz. And those shows did good. They had pretty good ratings, but I would say it's because of their middle-brow taste culture that it was off-brand with MSNBC. They were trying to appeal to this educated, affluent demographic, and they didn't want to, alienate them with this populist sensibility. And so I think that's the key to me. And every time the left kind of plays with this, they generally abandon those kind of hosts, those kind of styles.
George Lakoff has a perspective where, media aside, he argues that some of the arguments of the right are just structurally better suited to commercial media. Like, a couple examples would be, hey, abortion's murder, so it should be banned. And on the left, It's like, well, we've got to talk about viability, and then you have to understand sort of like the 40-week pregnancy and mammalian gestation, and we have to it's not like a good bumper sticker phrase. Or, hey, the taxes, it's my money. Let me keep my money. Whereas the left is like, well, yes, once societies get large enough, some roles need to be centralized, and so we have to find the right tax. Right? It's like, so he makes a more linguistic that sort of approach. How important is that versus like strategic media decisions that are made by left and right?
I think it's critical. I'm not, Lakoff, the insights of Lakoff is that the first way we interface with politics is often through these moral registers. It's not through these like nuanced policy discussions or what the facts are. We really start with aesthetics and moral frames, and then we move to the policies. Those things, it's not that those things don't matter. It's just the way in which people interface and the sequencing that they kind of come to engage in politics through. And I agree. I mean, there's other civil rights leaders like Reverend Barber, who's excellent. He's been calling for the progressives to develop what he calls a kind of universal moral language. And it doesn't mean when you speak in these moral terms, you have to abandon nuance or complexity. It's just to recognize that is engaging from up front, right? That you're really laying out these kind of positions. And the right is really good at recognizing, not just speaking in a moralistic way, but recognizing what moral political stories have had resonance over time. They're very good at looking at, like you just mentioned, this idea that I work hard and I deserve the fruits of my labor, right? there's a way you could frame that in a left-wing way. Yeah, the labor movement works hard, and they're the ones who create wealth, right? You could use that same moral frame like FDR did, but the right captures it, co-ops, and then turns that into a story about the fruits of labor is really giving these business people and the job creators like all their hard work, and so we need not to tax them because they're the most productive segments of society. So the right is like very savvy at recognizing which narratives have resonated and been recycled over political history, and where the left kind of shuns these things in what the name of intellectual complexity, or that it's too hokey or corny. And I just think that again, that's another way, and yet they're shooting themselves in the foot.
What do you make strategically about the recent focus from the Republican Party in media on the culture war stuff, anti-woke, the trans issues, men in women's sports, as they like to call it, et cetera? A lot of the rhetoric is the same rhetoric that was assigned to gay men 10 years ago that has just moved on now and taken a little bit of a different tone. But do you think that from a media studies perspective, that it is a logical thing for the right to be doing temporarily or even on the medium term, or is it a mistake strategically?
It all depends on if, Murdoch has always been very good at taking something that seems, somewhat petty, like M&Ms being
Yep.
having, androgynous boots on or something like that. And everyone on the left laughs at it, right? We're like, oh, it's so ridiculous. They care about these little things. But it's the way in which they'll take something that is palpable and mundane and everyday and connect it to the broader world of politics. And that actually makes politics more palpable, gives it texture. And so they're only successful if they just get too in the weeds with CRT and trans issues and don't connect it to these broader narratives about how liberals look down on us and they're part of the educated elite and they're the campus-based crowd and we're the working class crowd. That's when those kind of culture war narratives pack their biggest punch. But it's like when I look at DeSantis, for example, he just lacks that ability to take those issues and kind of turn them into broader class narratives about elitism and about we're on the side of authentic people and normal people. And he's just overly online. And it just seems like it starts to seem like you're actually just your tactic is too naked. You're just scapegoating. You're creating a scapegoat for the sake of creating a scapegoat. And it doesn't feel like it has this broader populist message, where Trump is very good at exploiting those class cultural tensions between the college educated and the non-college educated class. So I think that's where they're the best, is when they can package it in some sort of larger populist class critique. It's at its worst when it just is nakedly bigoted and nakedly a kind of subculture of the right, that they're obsessed with, an extreme kind of religious subculture.
Speaking of like the online media space versus kind of like outside of it, one of the conversations I had with my audience during the 2020 Democratic primary was that spending a lot of time on Twitter and Reddit would likely give you an overemphasized perspective on how popular Bernie Sanders is within the Democratic Party. And I had the belief, and I think there was polling to bear it out, that people who are just like working in Michigan and then picking up their kids and going home, they're not necessarily on Twitter and Reddit in the same way, if they're on it at all. And that Joe Biden's support among the Democratic Party voters is likely much higher than it seems. And this seemed to be the case. Now, yes, to some degree, there was this coordinated, everybody got out of Joe Biden's way after South Carolina. Like that's true. But I think the point kind of still remains there. Has this online discourse actually become deceptive in terms of figuring out quote, what people care about? Maybe not only on the left, but also on the right, in the sense that I don't know that many Republican voters, the sorts of people that kind of want like a Chris Christie or a Mitt Romney, are that engaged with like the so-called men and women's sports thing or the anti-woke. Has online really distorted what people care about?
I mean, I think undeniably, I think that when you really get to the 2016 election, which is really this important pivotal shift, I think, in our media culture and our politics, where, you're no longer seeing Obama dance with Ellen DeGeneres and Hillary Clinton, goes on stage with Beyonce. It's like this is that old kind of monoculture model, right? The vestiges of the network era where you could still do that kind of politics. What we see in 2016 is the online fringes start to emerge and have outsized influence, kind of erasing this normie kind of middle brow political center, right? And so it creates this deception that they're bigger or they're more representative of both their respective political sides than they actually are. And I think you're right. I kind of was guilty of that too. When you consume Bernie kind of aligned media so much, when the 2020 election happened, I realized that there are people that actually have much more cemented pro-Democratic Party normie loyalties. MSNBC and CNN actually did have some power, regardless of all the calls that they're dying, they're dead, they're irrelevant.
Yeah.
I think they showed they're still kind of shaping what your average middle of the road Democratic voter thinks. And so I'm with you. I mean, I think there is an overconfidence sometimes with the kind of alternative political media spheres. But with that said, it is undeniable that people are cord cutting. It's undeniable that cable is in decline, and that even it's the writing's on the wall. Even those organizations have tried to do an over-the-top streaming model. Fox Nation, CNN Plus. They're seeing how the independent alternative sphere is getting larger and larger and larger and wielding more political influence. So I think we're in this moment of transition, right? So it's hard to prognosticate like what's what or who's listening to who's driving the agenda. It's much more unclear than it was back in 2008 or even at the beginning of 2016.
That's for sure. We've been speaking with Associate Professor at the City University of New York, Reece Peck, also author of the book Fox Populism, Branding Conservatism as Working Class. Reece, really appreciate your time and insights today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.